Welcome, everybody. It's Sunday. Happy Sunday to everybody. And thank you so much for joining us on our Gleneagles University Zoomcast. Isn't that a cool word? We're excited to have Annette Isaacs here. And she's on the west coast of Florida. And hopefully one day she'll make it over to the East Coast. But she has had so many great topics over the last year. And it's exciting. We're going to talk about the Berlin Airlift, and there's so much to know about it, but she's going to start with the history, and hopefully afterwards we will do the answers and questions and answers, and also see how it could reflects on what's happening right now in the Ukraine. So Annette, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Tammy, and thank you everybody for signing on. Let me just share my screen so that we all can see the nice pictures. Slideshow. Oops. Okay, yeah, so as Tammy already said, my name is Annette Isaacs. I am a German historian and public educator, and I'm coming to you from Fort Myers, from the other side, basically. And we are talking about this topic because, of these current events, and also because I wanted to tell you about a time, when the Soviets were kind of predatory. And so that, of course, was happening in 1948. And of course, the Berlin Airlift was an amazing event. It was the greatest relief operation in aviation history. So let's learn what it was and how it started. And of course, everything, when it comes to the new Germany started after 1945, because that, of course, is the year where the Second World War was over, and Germany, of course, lost the Second World War. And while the ordinary Germans, here we have a picture of the so-called Trümmerfrauen, the Rubble Women. So these were women between the ages of 15 and 50, and they were at times, using their own hands or whatever tools they could find in order to kind of help with the reconstruction of Germany. While this was happening on the civilian level, the politicians, of course, the so-called anti-Hitler coalition, they were meeting in the city of Potsdam, which is just outside of Berlin, for the so-called Potsdam Conference. So let me show you this picture. This is very exciting. This is the first time that your President Truman, who had just become the president a couple of months earlier, is meeting Stalin. And that Potsdam Conference was from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945. Here we have the so-called Big Three. We have, of course, Churchill, we have Stalin, and then your President Truman. You know what was interesting? Churchill was actually not able to stay for the entire conference because he was voted out of office. Imagine, he lost the election. Can you imagine what the audacity of the British people? They are winning the Second World War, and then they immediately are voting out their prime minister. So he had to leave, and then a couple of days later, the new prime minister came, and that was Clement Attlee, who was quite an inexperienced politician, and you can see that here. He was from the Labour Party, and Churchill was always good with words. And Churchill said of Attlee once, Attlee is a modest man with much to be modest about. So he was certainly not going to stand up to Stalin. Look at this. So the idea, to divide Germany was not really conceived in Potsdam for the first time. That had already been done here at Yalta, at the Yalta conference that happened in February of 1945. And there, of course, you see in the middle your President Roosevelt, who looks rather pale or rather weak. And then, of course, 2 months later, he was actually passing away. But this division of Germany was meticulously planned in Potsdam. And that is what happened. So Germany was going to lose its sovereignty, and it was now going to be owned, if you will, by the Allied forces. And it was going to be divided into these occupation zones. And so we have, of course, if you take a look at the American zone, that would have been southern Germany, but also Frankfurt, the area in Hessen. Then everything that is brown, that would have been, of course, the Soviet zone. And then you have the British zone, that was northern Germany, with also Düsseldorf, with this Cologne, this area. And then what really does make sense, the French zone was going to be the area that borders on France anyway. But not only Germany as a country was divided, also Berlin as the former capital city of Nazi Germany was also divided. And here you see these sectors, and you see that the whole eastern part went to the Soviets. And so the country was from now on governed by Allied institutions, the Allied Control Council and the Allied Kommandatura. The Allied Control Council was responsible for the entire country, and the Kommandatura for issues surrounding the city of Berlin. And so, what's interesting is that, of course, now immediately following, one could say, the Second World War, this anti-Hitler coalition was slowly but surely falling apart. The Western allies were mistrusting Stalin. And of course, in retrospect, we can say rightly so, because he created all these socialist satellite states in the Central and Eastern European countries. And they feared that Germany would be his next victim, so to speak. And this was, of course, as we all know, the beginning of the Cold War. And if you thought that people at the time didn't know what was at stake, that was not the case at all. Your US Secretary of State at the time, Dean Acheson, said it actually quite poetically. He said, "Russia and the United States are involved in a struggle for the soul of Europe." Isn't that something? It became clear quite quickly that the Russians wanted the Western allies out of Berlin. And if you take a look at this map, you could see that maybe, Stalin has a little bit of a case, because everything that you see here on this picture, everything that is red would be West Germany. Everything that is yellow would be East Germany. And then the little tiny red dot that is in the middle of East Germany, that is West Berlin. And of course, Stalin saw himself as the rightful owner, if you will, of the entire city. And that was, of course, an assumption that the Western allies wholeheartedly rejected. Berlin, at the time, Berlin had received that four-power status because it was the biggest city in all of Germany. It had 3 million people. 2 million people were living in the West, 1 million people was living in the East. And leaving Berlin, and therefore surrendering these 2 million people in West Berlin to the Soviets, would not have been something that the Americans were interested in doing. So every month, around the 20th, or not around, but on the 20th of every month, there was a meeting of the Allied Control Council. So they would meet and they would talk. But of course, the more, this Cold War was kind of heating up a little bit, they had nothing to say to each other because they didn't see eye to eye when it came to anything. And so on the 20th of March 1948, it became especially heated. And so that is when the representative of the Soviet Union left the Allied Control Council meeting in a huff, and he vowed to never come back. And that is when the Russians started to become a little nasty, because a couple of days later, you had the first delays and temporary closings of west-east and east-west traffic routes that were reported. And so from April 2nd to April 4th, 1948, then 51-year-old General Lucius W. Clay, who was a West Point graduate from Georgia, he actually was the most important person when it comes to the American sector or the American zone, because he was the military governor of the Americans. And so he organized the so-called baby airlift. Some historians call it the little lift. And this was a mini version. This really only happened for 2 days, from April 2nd to April 4th. And what happened in these 2 days was that Americans planes delivered 200 tons of army supplies from Frankfurt to Berlin. And that worked pretty well because, you know, if you have a C-54, it has a loading capacity of 10 tons. And if you think about it, you know, they were bringing 200 tons. So that means 20 flights. So you can do that in 2 days. But of course, the idea of kind of doing it on a big scale was really something that General Clay never really thought of. So he was actually interviewed before the airlift started. And this was like in April, you know. And then one of the journalists was saying, can you imagine that one could do that on a greater scale? And then he said, and I quote, absolutely not. So that was what he was thinking in April and May of 1948. One of the biggest bones of contention between the Western Allies and the Soviets was how to deal with the enormous black market in Germany, which was actually at that time the only active economy back then. Especially in Berlin, the illegal barter system had become a way of life for almost everybody. The Western Allies tried to curb this chaos by creating the so-called currency reform. And this is another thing that is really quite interesting, actually. What you see here is the first version of our Deutschmark, the Deutschmark that was such a beautiful currency that we had until 2002, until the euro came. And that Deutschmark was printed in the United States. It was kind of designed, it was printed in the United States, and then it was brought with big ships to Germany. And then in Germany, it was then distributed to the people there. And the result of that was really electrifying because now you had people who had like businessmen or businesswomen, they were now abandoning the barter system and they returned to selling goods for cash. The Soviets were kind of caught off guard because they, of course, had not been at these meetings, right, for the last 3 months. And so that is why they were thinking, yeah, well, what are we going to do now? We now also have to have a currency reform. And so they, of course, they neither had the time nor the money to create a new currency for East Germany. And so that is why they used the Nazi money and put a Russian stamp on it and said, okay, this is now going to be valid in all of East Germany and in all of Berlin, also in West Berlin. And the Western Allies said, no, certainly not. In West Berlin, we're going to have the Deutschmark. And so that was it, you know, for the Russians. They reacted angrily and most of all instantaneously, because on the evening that currency reform was announced, the Russians stopped all passenger traffic between the Western zones and Berlin by road and by rail. Furthermore, they increased the military presence at the Soviet zonal border really greatly. We now had like 500,000 Russian soldiers that were at that border. And so one day later, on June 24th, Russian guards stopped an American military goods train at the border, which was in and of itself a blatant disregard for the Four Power Treaty that, of course, had granted uninhibited access to Berlin. That's why you had Checkpoint Charlie. You know, that's why you were always able to walk up and down, you know, Checkpoint Charlie when the Berlin Wall was there in the 60s. So that was all negotiated in Potsdam. But the Russians were now not letting the Americans through. Imagine that. And so the Russians actually, and what was even worse was that one Russian soldier, removed a rail in front of that military goods train. And this was not only a grand provocation, but it was also the beginning of the so-called Berlin blockade. And that led to the famous Berlin Airlift. The decision, we already talked about that, to supply these 2 million people in West Berlin through an airlift was really not an easy one to make because it was kind of considered utopian. Imagine 2 million people. How are you going to do this, you know? But General Clay, for him, it was clear that he was not going to leave Berlin, although there were several people at the newly established Defense Department who were toying with the idea. There was actually a teleconference with President Truman and with people from the Defense Department. And some of them really said, Berlin is such a can of worms. Why don't we just leave? And then General Clay said the very famous sentence, "We must not budge." And then your President Truman said, yes, okay, if you think we must not budge, we won't budge. And the thing about that also was that General Clay had a counterpart from the British, and that was General Robertson. And General Robertson was very much for the airlift. And he said, we have nothing to lose, let's at least try it. Okay, so the decision was made. We're going to do an airlift, but where are we going to get all the planes? Well, we are going to make a call, and we're going to call this man. And this is, of course, Curtis Lemay. And Curtis Lemay was sitting in Wiesbaden, and he was the commander-in-chief of the United States Air Forces in Europe. So he was the head of it all. So if you wanted to have airplanes, this is the person that you talk to. And here we see what the New York Times said about it. US will mobilize planes in Europe to supply Berlin, and then US sends 39 C-54s. And you might say, that's pretty nice, 39. Well, actually, we needed like 700. We don't need 39, because the thing at the time was they only had 70 airplanes in Germany at their disposal. And so 39, okay, it kind of helps a little, but actually we do need hundreds and hundreds of more airplanes. And that is why it was so incredible. That is why General Lemay was mobilizing planes from all over the world. I mean, there were 10,000 people from the Air Force were making their way to Germany, to Wiesbaden, to Berlin. Well, basically first to Wiesbaden, and then they were flying to Berlin. But the thing was, they came as far as Japan. They had these big like ships, with the where they put planes. And then, of course, you can imagine if you are now taking a ship from Japan to Frankfurt, it kind of takes a little while. But yeah, over 10,000 people were mobilized. And then, of course, they were thinking, okay, who should we make the commander of this entire operation? And they decided on this one here, Brigadier General Joseph Smith, who was a distinguished veteran of the Air Force, who established many of the basic procedures of the airlift. And before we go any further, I have to tell you about this, because this is these are the 3 air corridors. So after the war, the Western Allies somehow missed the opportunity to obtain a written agreement from the Russians regarding the uninhibited access to West Berlin via road and via rail. And that is why, you had this issue going on. That is why they were doing the Berlin blockade. But they were the Western Allies were not as trusting when it came to the airspace, because in November of 1945, there was actually a written agreement signed by all 4 powers that regulated the use of the airspace. And that made the Berlin airlift possible, because if you can take if you look at this map, you see, of course, that the airspace that we are needing is only there. It's this airspace over East Germany. And so what happened was that in that agreement, it irrevocably allowed the Western Allies to use 3 air corridors, and each one of them was 20 miles wide between West German army bases, or basically Air Force bases, and West Berlin. So let me see. I have a laser pointer because I would like to show you something. So here we have them. So this is the corridor that the Americans were using. This is the corridor that the British were using. So don't think that you can fly around here. So this is not how this is working. You have to stay in your 20-mile wide air corridor. And that was very difficult, because if you were flying around here, then of course the Russians would have been able to kill you, And if you take a look at this is again, that's the American zone. And you can see they only have these two areas. And then here in Bavaria, in like lower Bavaria, they have something too. But Oberpfaffenhofen was not really used as an Air Force base. This was mostly used for airplane maintenance. But don't be jealous of the British, because the British have so many. But the thing is really that while the British had more like airfields in that sense, Rhine-Main is actually where now the Frankfurt airport is. And of course, if you have ever been at the Frankfurt airport, you know how vast this is. And of course, Wiesbaden is still a very iconic and very important Air Force base for the Americans. So this was a whole different ball game than like these little tiny things. But you can see this is longer than this, right? So this would have been about 60 minutes, and then this would have been about 90 minutes. And so the first big rule that General Smith was creating was that these air corridors would only use one-way traffic, and the middle corridor would be used for coming back to West Germany. So basically you're flying up here, you're of course landing in West Berlin, then you're unloading, and then you are coming back through this corridor here. So or the British would come down here, and then they would unload, and then they would come back here. So this is how that all worked. And in the beginning, they only had, or they mostly had, these two airplane types, the C-47 and the C-54. The C-47 was a little faster than the C-54, but the C-47 had this one problem, and that problem was that it unfortunately only had a loading capacity of about 3.5 tons, whereas the C-54 was really the workhorse of the airlift, and that had a loading capacity of about 10 tons. So of course it would be in their interest to have more C-54s. But of course, now, of course, we have to send all of these planes to Berlin, and that was quite a problem. I lived in Berlin for many years, and there is a museum that is called the Berlin Airlift Museum. And so here, and I took a couple of pictures that I also put into this presentation. And so here we have one of the pictures, because in order to account for these different cruising speeds and for the fact that you now have hundreds of airplanes that are coming and going, General Smith created this block system with similar planes flying together at 5 different altitudes. Can you imagine what these poor people there in Berlin at the towers, they didn't know what hit them. There were so many airplanes, hundreds and hundreds of airplanes. And it turned out quite quickly that this was way too much to handle for the controllers. And so that is why General Smith was then changing it to only 3 different blocks, instead of 5. And still, though, it was in the beginning, in these first 4 weeks, it wasn't easy, because the thing was that a lot of these airplanes had to circle around the airport in Berlin, around Tempelhof, until they were finally able to land. And that, of course, wasn't really very effective, And then, of course, here we see what happened, very, very busy. And this is then when the planes arrived, then the hour of the army arrived, because don't think that only the Air Force was involved in the airlift. It was also the people from the army, because they organized all the goods that were needed. And they helped with the loading and the unloading, and most important, of course, also with the distribution of goods to the various Berliner help organizations, which then in turn distributed the food to the population. There were, of course, unfortunately, a couple of problems when it comes to General Smith's idea, and one, of course, was the one with the circling. Then there was a lot of downtime, so you had the pilots who were waiting in Tempelhof, and one of the biggest indicators that the first 4 weeks weren't really super successful had to do with the fact that the daily tonnage was not met. So General Clay and his team, they were figuring out that in order to keep 2 million people alive, you had to bring 4,500 tons of coal, of foodstuffs to Berlin every day. And in those 4 weeks, only 2,185 tons were brought to Berlin every day. And that wasn't enough, because they were realizing this is less than half of what we actually need in order to keep these people alive. And so that is why back in Wiesbaden, General Lemay was making a phone call, and he called this person, General William Tanner, who then became the hero of the airlift, because he had already gained a superb reputation within the Air Force 3 years earlier, because he was the commander of the Hump operation. And Hump was that the Himalaya mountains. So he was organizing this idea of flying supplies to nationalist Chinese troops fighting the Japanese over the Himalaya mountains. And so everybody knew him, and everybody thought he should really be the person who should be the airlift commander. Lemay said about, after the airlift was over, he said about the 42-year-old, he said, Tanner's assignment to the airlift was rather like appointing John Wingling to get the circus on the road. So I thought that was a really nice saying. So Tanner arrived in Wiesbaden on July 29th, 1948, and his first activity was to hop on a plane to come to Berlin. And there he looked at the situation over there, and what he saw was not making him happy at all, because he saw airplanes parked at crazy angles, overworked air crews. The pilots were sitting in the inside in the terminal. A lot of planes were not really coming and going on schedule. And then he also saw near misses, that kind of planes almost had collisions. And he said, this is a cowboy operation. I have to really change this. And so that is what he did. And so he had a couple of rules and the guiding principles that were quite important. So the first one was that he said, look, an airlift is nothing, it's not adventurous or anything exciting. An airlift, it really is like clockwork. And that's why we are going to fly at 3-minute intervals all around the clock. And this is 24/7. We don't have any holidays. We don't have any time off. The second rule, and that was a very important one, was that if a plane could not land in Berlin at the first attempt, it has to go back to West Germany and then come back and try again. The third rule was that all pilots needed to fly under instrument rules, as if in foggy weather. And so that also added to this kind of clockwork situation, because they weren't flying like faster and slower and up and down, but they really had to look at their instruments. And then the fourth rule, and that was a rule that almost created a little mutiny when it comes to the pilots, because the fourth rule was that when the pilots arrived in Berlin, they couldn't leave their planes. And the pilot said, that's not going to work for us, because we need to go into the terminal for our coffee, for our donuts. So General Tanner thought, interesting. Let me think about that. And so he came up with this, with mobile snack bars. And this was so wonderful because these mobile snack bars were then driving, to all of the planes. And there they were then giving these goodies like the cigarettes and the coffee and the chocolate and the donuts to the pilots. General Tanner always had the well-being of his teams in mind. And so he personally called the Red Cross in Berlin that was organizing these snack bars. And he demanded that the teams that worked in these mobile snack bars were made up only by the prettiest girls Berlin has to offer. So, and that is why there were a lot of beautiful blonde Fräuleins. And then, of course, you can imagine that all the pilots were very happy. So yes, so altogether, when we think about this now, this is really looking very professional, doesn't it? And so, of course, what is the most important indicator of success is those 4,500 tons, remember, because we need 4,500 tons every day in coal or in food to be brought to West Berlin. So let's take a look. What about July? Remember, this is the one, where General Lemay said, oh, this is not really going well. We have to call somebody. And that was in July. We had 2,185. Then August, look, almost much, or already much better, 3,835. And then by September, the original goal was surpassed, and now they had 4,953 tons every day. So that was very exciting. There was this one problem that General Tanner was not able to solve, and that was the accommodations. Remember, Germany, of course, at that time was a desert of rubble. Of course, we didn't have apartments for all of these 10,000 people who came and worked at the airlift. So that is why, in many cases, these poor pilots there, they had to stay in these tents. A little later, Nissen huts, so you might know them under the word Quonset huts, they were brought to Berlin from Frankfurt. Here we see a picture of one of them coming from Frankfurt, but still, it certainly wasn't a 5-star hotel, but it was maybe better than one of these tents. What's interesting? Look, this is what the Royal Air Force, let's not forget that the Royal Air Force was, of course, also working quite hard when it came to the airlift. So here we have the so-called Sunderland Fluke boat. This is what we call it. And this was a seaplane that was landing on Berlin's lakes. And then once they approached the airport in Tempelhof, the American pilots had to be very focused because this was a very difficult airport to land on, because it was in the middle, or land in. It was in the middle of Berlin. And of course, can you imagine? There were so many people who were standing there. And at times, you had to kind of fly very, very closely. And so, of course, and then the other thing, don't think that the Russians were standing idly by. They were, of course, always harassing the pilots, the American and the British pilots. They would do things like they sometimes would even send their Yak fighter planes up into the air. They would sometimes have like floodlights, especially in the evenings. They would shine floodlights onto the or into the sky. It was really quite terrible. And of course, taking all these circumstances into consideration, it is not surprising that there were accidents and sadly also some deaths to report. So here we have an accident that happened rather early in the operation, where we have a plane that struck an apartment building near the airport. And then here we have August 13th, which happened to have been a Friday. That's why everybody called it the Black Friday, where we have 4 planes that were crashing at the end of a runway there at Tempelhof. And then here, look how terrible. You have a C-54 that is landing at Gatow, which is the airport actually that's in northern Berlin. So this is in the British zone. This is what the British used. And then they are flying over a wreck of another plane. And as these accidents happened, though, they didn't happen very often, because when you think of it, there were over 250,000 flights and not a lot of accidents at all. They were rather rare. And one of the reasons for that was that by October of 1948, you had the so-called replacement training that was happening in Great Falls, Montana. So that was an American Air Force base where the people who got their marching papers, to come to the Berlin Airlift, they had to come to Montana for 2 weeks, where they had their replacement training, where they were learning how to fly with a lot of coal, because coal was so important. It was the only form of electricity at the time, of energy, So, and then here, look what a nice picture, they are bringing milk. And so, of course, back in Germany, everybody was kind of settling into the groove of things, but people were maybe a little bit bored by the monotony of always flying back and forth. But of course, our hero, General Tanner, had this wonderful idea of creating a newspaper. And that newspaper was called the Task Force Times. Here we see the banner of the first page. And that newspaper didn't only have like information about, how the operation was going, and also everybody who was involved in the airlift was encouraged to kind of send in a picture or write a little story and publish it there. They also had this man, and this man is somebody from, this man is Jake Shufford from Pennsylvania, and he was known as the most popular, basically, enlisted man in the Air Force. He was actually Tanner's radio man, but it really wasn't his radio skills that were so famous. It was actually the fact that he was a cartoonist. He loved creating little fun cartoons. And I have brought you some, nice selection of it. So let's take a look. What do you think this is? What do you think this is? A drive-in? Let me just change this so that I can see everything here. What is this drive? Yeah, that I thought was kind of cute. And then here, this one. Uh-oh, I forgot to wake Sergeant Hogan before we took off. I see, Lieutenant Donovan has the damn hiccups again. This will entirely revolutionize the Follow Me Jeep. And then this is kind of funny. That is the airlift hitch. You see the replacement training. So usually they were working. One tour in Germany was about 6 months. So there he is. After the 6 months, yoo-hoo, rotation. He gets to go back to America. My favorite one is this one. Yes, General. We have a copy of your memoirs. It's over there on the fiction shelf. That's so cute. And then here, this story. I've been doing this presentation for, I would say, about 10 years, and I never had to say that he died, but unfortunately he did. Just in February, Gail passed away. He was 101 years old. Isn't that amazing? I don't know if you ever heard about this amazing story about Gail Halverson, but yeah, so as you can see, he was 28 years old in 1948, and he was a pilot, and he had, what's interesting, sometimes pilots and also like flight attendants, they have sinusitis, a lot of sinusitis. Maybe it's because of the air pressure or something. And so his mother gave him a duffel bag with handkerchiefs. And he said, what am I doing with this duffel bag? And she said, well, just take it. Maybe you can use it. So he came to Germany. And then the first thing that he did was hop on a plane to Berlin. And there he saw all the little Berliners there. And he was, Gail Halverson never met a stranger. He was such a nice man. And so he talked to these little kids, some of them were learning English. They would be able to speak English. And so he thought, yes, their parents, their grandparents, all the Nazis, they are horrible people. But these little kids, they have nothing to do with anything. So I would like to do something nice for these kids. And so that is why he remembered the handkerchiefs that his mother gave him. And he also remembered that every day, the people who were involved in the airlift had a daily ration of chocolate. And that's what he created. Look, isn't that so fun? And so it's a parachute, a chocolate parachute. And so then the next day, or he was telling the little kids, I'm going to come back the next day. And so you have to be here because I have a surprise. And then the kid said, well, I mean, that's all nice and dandy, but the problem is that you and 700 other people are coming with their planes. How are we going to know that it's you? And then he said, good point. And so he said, okay, I'm going to wiggle my wings. And this is why the little kids called him Mr. Wiggly Wings. So the next day he comes, he's wiggling his wings. And then, of course, he lets these parachutes fall down from the sky. And of course, you can imagine that the children are losing their minds. They're so happy about it. And so the next day, because, usually good news travels fast. So the next day when he came back, of course, to a much greater fan base. Now everybody wanted to have chocolate. And so then, of course, more and more children were writing him letters, but of course, they didn't know his name. So that's why they were addressing the letters to Mr. Wiggly Wings, Americans, Wiesbaden, or Candy Bomber, US Air Force, Wiesbaden. And the person who got these letters was certainly not Gail Halverson. The person who got these letters was General Tanner. And he thought, what is this? Who is this? What is Mr. Wiggly Wings? What are we talking about here? And so Gail was a little nervous, but he confided in General Tanner and said, well, it's actually me, and I don't know if I'm doing something wrong. And General Tanner said, no, this is really great. This is really such a wonderful gesture, because all those little kids are going to love the Americans. And so that is why he gave Gail 2 German secretaries that were helping him with the correspondence. And he also, General Tanner also said all these military wives, they should help with creating these parachutes. And so that is why, that happened. And in those 6 months that Gail Halverson was in Germany, not only he, but also there were also several other candy bombers in that sense. They actually dropped 10 tons of candy and chocolate in 6 months. It's pretty astonishing. Cartoonist Jake Schaffert, let's see. Yes, there, look at that. He was a little rascal, that Jake Schaffert. Look at what he's talking about here, the rather unusual parachute. It's a bra. So now, of course, when it comes to kind of unusual cargo, of course, after like 4 or 5 months, the airlift was really in a really great state. You had it was so perfectly organized that there was also space on these planes for other things, for things other than foodstuffs and coal. And so, for example, the West Berliners needed to build an electricity plant and had all the parts flown in from Frankfurt. Isn't that incredible? Or here, I'm sure that you already see what that is. It's a car, it's a Volkswagen Beetle. So that was also brought because the police force in West Berlin needed some cars, so they were bringing that. But of course, the cutest cargo was Clarence. Clarence was a baby camel who was intended for the Berlin Zoo, and he arrived with a lot of fanfare, as you can see here. Now, of course, then when Christmas was coming along, you had a quite a very skinny Santa Claus who was giving away beautiful presents. And now when we talk about really exceptional cargo, who's that? Yes, it's of course Bob Hope. Bob Hope, by the way, for the first time, I mean, we all know that Bob Hope, of course, during the Second World War, he was already entertaining troops, but this was his first Christmas show. And he loved this Christmas show so much that he would, for the next 36 consecutive Christmases, he would actually do shows for the USO. Isn't that something? And he didn't come alone. As you can see here, he came with Irving Berlin. That's the man with this beautiful coat there. That's Irving Berlin. And then a beautiful woman by the name of Jinx Falkenberg. And they also had a song. Irving Berlin wrote a song. It was pretty astonishing. And then another person that you might be familiar with is this one. Who is that? That is, everybody always says Charlie McCarthy, but that's not a person. The person is Edgar Bergen. Charlie McCarthy is the doll or the dummy. But yeah, so Edgar Bergen, he came also to entertain troops. And, you know, the Berliners, they were just so happy and so thankful for everybody who helped during the airlift, and especially during the winter, because you can imagine winter time is always icky. And especially in Berlin, it was cold, it was foggy. And then to really fly these planes back and forth wasn't very easy. But, you know, every time when the pilots arrived, people were just so thankful, and they were giving them little gifts, and they had the so-called Berliner look. As you can see here, they're always looking up. And then the children, the biggest children's game of the season was, of course, the Berlin Airlift. And so then when spring approach, spring of 1949, New York Times columnist Anne O'Hare McCormick said, and I quote her, this is from March 4th. She says, the most extraordinary thing about the airlift today is that it's no longer extraordinary. It is taken for granted by the population and occupying forces that it can be continued indefinitely if necessary. And she was right, because General Tanner had actually worked out a contingency plan that saw to it that the airlift would be able to continue for another 10 years. Imagine, it could have gone on until the end of time. And so, of course, the Russians were now a little bit unhappy, because they were thinking, oh, this is not really going our way, right? And then General Tanner had something in him that was the Easter parade. They were calling it the Easter parade. It happened on Easter Saturday of 1949. And look what the New York Times is talking about. 12,941 tons of food and of coal were flown into Berlin for that day. Isn't that incredible? And that was so insane, because look, this is what the Berlin Airlift Museum says. That means that every 62 seconds, an airplane was landing. Can you imagine? So after this event is over here tonight, please look at your watches for 62 seconds. And then think about what that means. 62 seconds, every 62 seconds, a plane would land. And that was it, you know, for the Russians. They were like, okay, well, Bev, touche, you won. And so that's why they decided at the end of April, they decided that on May 12th, 1949, they would end the blockade. And then when that day came, of course, that was really met with huge celebrations, you can imagine, because that meant that, of course, all the trains and all the cars and the trucks were able to come to Berlin again. So now let's take a look at the airlift in numbers. You can see when we talk about the flights that definitely the Americans had most of the flights, over 189,000. Then the British had 87,000. And then the French, yes, of course, 400. It's a little cute. But the thing about, people always laugh when they look at the French number. But the thing about them was that they had their own war in Indochina. And so they really, they had other problems than helping the Germans. And then here we see the transported goods, what they brought. And of course, the most of them, the most of the goods were coal. was coal, 1.5 million tons of coal. Also passenger transports, but don't really think that that was something that you would say, hello, Americans, I'd like to go to Munich to just travel a little bit. That was not how that worked. You actually had to have a very important reason. Maybe you were very sick and you had to go to a hospital, or you were an orphan and you had to go to relatives in West Germany or so. Then you would be brought. So here we have the last flight, September 30th, 1949. It's very interesting because didn't I just say that the blockade was over in May? Well, yeah, but then why did they fly all through the summer? Well, it was very important for the Americans to make sure that the Russians would never act up again. And so that is why all throughout the summer, the airlift continued, not in that big of an extent that it had continued earlier, but they were, building a lot of supplies for the West Berliners, just in case, just in case. And then here we see something interesting, because here you see that in total, these American planes clocked in 92 million miles during the airlift. And it was about $200 million. And that cut here, or that part came out of the Air Force's budget. So you can imagine that the Air Force already in 1948 had quite a lot of money. And then 2 years later, the Berliners were thanking their heroes with this, very interesting memorial. And this memorial was dedicated to the people who lost their lives defending the city's freedom. So altogether, there were 48 members of the British and the American Air Force who died during the airlift. And so this, this is what it looks like now. Luftbrücke is actually, this is how we call it in German, the air bridge. That's how we call the airlift. But what does that signify? It actually signifies the 3 air corridors that we had there, that I showed you before. Whoa, look, Gail Halverson in the year 2009. Look how agile he was at 89. So that was the 60th anniversary of the airlift. Of course, this is when there were still some veterans around. Then he came back in June of 2013 when a school was named after him. Look, the Gail Halverson Schule in the American district of Berlin. There we go. Everybody's very happy. Then here we have a picture of May 2015 when he was 95. And this is, of course, the woman to your left. That's his wife. The woman to the right was actually a girl in 1948 who caught one of these chocolate parachutes. And then this was when he was 99. And that was the 70th anniversary of the airlift. And then, of course, October 2020, as Utah's candy bomber turns 100, his sweet story remains timeless. And then here, oh, very sad. February of this year, he passed away. What happened to the airport, to Tempelhof? Well, we now have our own we have like other airports. We're not using this one anymore, but as you can see here, it became a beautiful park for the Berliners, and the Berliners are really excited about that because, when you have a little child, you can actually teach them how to ride a bike on one of these very historic runways. I would like to end this presentation and then also start, of course, our question and answer period. But I would like to remind you, though, that the Berlin airlift was not the end of the Cold War. It was, in a way, the beginning. Because when the Berliners were celebrating the end of the blockade, which happened, of course, in May of 1949, they, of course, did not have a crystal ball, and they did not see that 12 years later, a gigantic wall came into existence in 1961, the Berlin Wall, that cut through Berlin for 28 long years before the city and then eventually the country were able to be reunited again. And nowadays, though, or now for the next second, I would like to kind of show you these pictures again, because there we have another view of these wonderful heroes that we had there back in 1948, who really rescued 2 million lives. Right? How wonderful. So I thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I think that many of you were also thinking, you know, it kind of sounds very timely, right? When we think about what is happening right now with, of course, Putin. So let's see, do we have any people who have any questions? As you know, you can unmute yourself, or you can also put something in the chat and type it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and then ask your question that way.
Did you want to talk about, because there's a lot of articles going on, like what the Ukraine needs right now is a Berlin airlift. I know that's some of the reason that we're here today is to get your views on what's happening right now.
Well, you know what's so interesting when it comes to Germany is that we in Germany, as you know, we have, of course, Angela Merkel is not our chancellor anymore. And so we had this election, and the election, the results of the elections were that we now have a coalition government. And that coalition government is led by a social democratic chancellor by the name of Mr. Scholz. And then, of course, there's this coalition with the Green Party and with the Libertarians. And the Green Party is in and of itself very pacifist. And the Libertarians are in and of themselves very, we don't really want to get involved. And so we now have a very reluctant government. I mean, I don't really think that if Angela Merkel would still be in power, that she would now send any more weapons as we already do. So we are sending some, but I think that there's so much pressure on Germany, and that has, of course, to do with the oil, you know, with the oil and the gas. So we in Germany, and this is something, I mean, it's so when you think of it, why didn't our politicians see that coming? Why did, in the last 10 to 15 years, why did our politicians, and there is, and I mean, who was our chancellor? It was, of course, Angela Merkel. Why did she not see that making Germany's economy so dependent on Russian oil, on Russian gas? I mean, we are getting 50% of all the gas that we need for our economy to work. We get that from Putin. Imagine that. And so every day, millions of euros are being sent from Germany to Putin, you know, and of course he is, of course, then turning them out and buying more and more weapons. So it really is a problem, and so that is why people are saying we have to stop that. We have to stop getting oil and getting gas from the Russians, and that is why our economy minister, who is like a PhD in philosophy from the Green Party. I mean, what does he know? You know, I'm feeling so sorry for this man, because he came to power as this economy minister and this was all happening, of course, before the war started. So Germany was going to become, you know, fossil fuel independent. We were going to have like the green revolution, and everybody was going to be so wonderful. We would have like in the next decade, we would all have kind of wind energy and solar and so on. And then now, last week, he had to go and talk to the head of that little nation of Qatar. Qatar, Qatar, in the Middle East, to get oil because we didn't want Putin's oil. It's a big mess, you can imagine. And so on the one hand, you want to help the Ukrainians, but on the other hand, and we are doing that, but on the other hand, we are, of course, in a way actively, for lack of a better word, fueling the war by sending so much money to Russia. Yeah.
Anybody
Tammy,
Yes.
Tammy, Sheila here. I just want to ask her, what would be a practical way of not depending on the Soviet Union for so much energy in the short term and in the long term? What can they do? We know about solar and wind, but it does take time. Where can they go? The Middle East, the North Sea, where?
Well, one of the big issues is that we, of course, and this is all Mrs. Merkel, maybe Mrs. Merkel's doing, but we were all behind this, this idea of closing down all our nuclear power plants. So we had a lot of nuclear power plants, but then Fukushima happened, and that made us very nervous because we already lived through Chernobyl in the 80s. And then I think it was 2010, I think, that Fukushima happened. And then we were like done with this. We said enough already, because we do have, because of the fact that our Green Party has quite a bit of political influence, that is why we were then all saying, okay, well then let's just shut down our nuclear power and just get gas from the Russians. But of course, that was kind of dumb. So that's the big question. That's like the $64,000 question, is how is our government dealing with this? I mean, getting oil from Qatar. The thing, of course, what our Green Party says is we really have to now work on making everything electric. But then, of course, if we have electric cars, if now our car industry is so big and so successful, what if we all have electric cars? Then, of course, we need so much electricity. Where are we going to get this electricity? If it's not Putin, if it's not Russia, I think really, I mean, that's the point. And if I had the answer, I think I would be in Berlin and I would be a very well-paid person in the German government. But it's not going to be easy. And they also, there are some people, some journalists say, this is it. We now have kind of sold our soul to the devil. We just have, we are getting so much gas. We're getting so much oil from the Soviet Union, from Russia, from Putin, that we can't just say let's just stop it, because we are always hearing now these kind of doomsday articles in the newspapers, like what would happen if we would, or let's say Putin would actually say, we're going to now kind of give you less of the fuel and less of the oil and less of the gas, and so our bills, our energy bills are already through the roof. It is really incredible. I mean, everybody in Germany, almost every household received another bill. Of course, they are just coming out of a terrible winter, and so of course everybody was heating, putting their heating on, and so they are paying. I mean, for like one-bedroom apartments, they're paying like 200 euros every month. And of course, people can't afford that. And so now, of course, then everybody says, now we have to have a law that actually says that if you don't have a lot of money, then the government has to pay for your electricity. And there's so much to do, you know.
Can the nuclear plants be reactivated, and if so, how long?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, you know, because we still have we have 6 nuclear power plants, and we actually we were this year we were closing down 3 of them, so that we only would have had 3 more. But I think that they are holding off with that. You know, I think they are not really doing that, and it is, you know, there's always an issue, you know, because of the fact that you have, because, you know, when it comes to the Green Party and to everybody, you know, that is a very, you know, because on the other hand, we of course also want to rescue our climate. That's the thing too. Of course, we also have coal, you know, we are still doing coal, but coal is really something that a lot of Germans are saying, let's not, you know, then let's rather get some stuff from Putin than do the coal again. But yeah, it's very difficult. And then, of course, the thing also is that the Ukrainians, what they, of course, would really like is that NATO would come in and kill Putin. But of course, we can't do that. So that's a bridge too far, you know. The one thing that was problematic when it comes to our chancellor is that Mr. Scholz, Olaf Scholz is his name, from the Social Democratic Party. Olaf Scholz is a man who comes from northern Germany. So, and the people from northern Germany, so from Hamburg, they are in and of themselves very cool. You know, they're very you would if you don't know them, you would think they're very arrogant. You know, they're just like very like refined and taken aback and so on. And so that is something that in times of crises at times is a little difficult, because people are now saying, you know, he is like a robot. He never says that he's feeling sorry for the people in the Ukraine. You know, he's just, so he doesn't have any passion. So now when it comes to is it favorability rating? I think, you know, if the people are being asked, is he doing a good job? You now have 48% who say that he is. Only 48%, and the rest says no, he's not doing a good job. So that is also down from, of course, when we elected him back in December. So we elected him in September, but then in December he was installed as our chancellor.
So asking again about the nuclear, you have shut down, you have 6, and 3 are shut down. Can they be reactivated? Second of all, the others can be kept on, but what I'm hearing you say is they don't have the political will to do it. Is that
right? So yes, I mean, while we are speaking, this is all happening in real time, you know. So that is why I'm, of course, since I'm not privy to what is now being talked about in Berlin at these very important meetings, I can imagine that they are going to leave them on. But of course, in a country of 82 million people, we are the 4th largest economy in the world. It's not going to be enough to have 6 nuclear power plants. You know, there must be a lot of more things have to happen. You know, when it comes to BASF and Bayer, you know, all of these huge companies that have like hundreds of thousands of people working there, they need so much gas it's just insane. It's incredible. And so that is why we will never, I mean, there is no way that we would actually now be able to say, okay, Putin, we have not a leader or not a whatever of your fuel or your gas. We're not doing that at all. That is never going to happen. But, maybe we don't really need to kind of give him 30 million euros a day or something, right? I mean, don't quote me on but I think it is. I think it's insane how much money we are sending there. I think it really is like 30 million a day.
I think I have the Faders. Mr. and Mrs. Fader, do you have a question? Oh, I have to unmute yourself. Hang on. Unmute before you talk, Mr. Fader. Click on the unmute button. We can't hear you yet. Unmute.
There you go.
I'm
Okay, there you go.
unmuted. Okay.
Okay.
I was wondering who paid for all the merchandise that was shipped in during the Berlin Airlift, and who paid for the transportation, the airplanes and the gas and the salaries of all the people involved in keeping Berlin alive.
Yeah, that's a great question. That actually was all coming out of the Air Force's budget. And that is why it was $200 million at the time. That would be, I think, about $3 billion nowadays.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was all paid for by the Americans. But when it comes to the coal was coming from West Germany, because especially in the 1940s, of course, we still had a very big coal industry there. And that wasn't the big issue, but it was like, for example, potato flakes. Potato flakes came from America and corn came from America. Yes. But other things came from Bavaria. Bavaria was a very big agrarian area, so they were sending things too. Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to say something.
Yes.
There are other alternate sources of energy that not necessarily the atomic energy that we're familiar with, which has all these bad effects to it. And if you saw the series Occupied, when Russia took over Norway, he had a thorium plant. And there are thorium plants in some countries, but a lot of the governments don't look at it. But now they may consider this as a clean source of energy.
And what is that, thorium? I've never heard of it.
Yes, it is, what is it? Thorium is
It's similar to
it doesn't use
atomic.
uranium. It doesn't use uranium. And what it is, the reason America looked at it is because there's a lot of thorium on Mars. And they were thinking when they were going to go there, so we've developed some of it, but we just haven't built it because nobody in government is really too interested in proceeding in that area. But maybe now with all the necessary things. And the second thing is Germany is very into using garbage in areas to create energy. And we have plants in America that are built by German companies. I know because I know somebody who's working for them. And that's clean energy again. So there are other ways of getting it. I think it is not as hopeless as it sounded. Totally.
Yes.
But not only is there hope, but they must proceed. And
Right.
nobody was doing it. Maybe now it's there.
Right.
Hopefully.
Well, I think the Chinese are building thorium plants in
Yeah, the
China.
Chinese.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I
Right.
have to look into this. I've never heard of it. How interesting.
Watch the series Occupied.
Yeah, well, that's a novel.
I know. Yeah, but it talks about, it even shows a plant. So there must be a plant in Norway
Yes.
where they filmed it.
Oh,
So
good.
yes, and
Thank
sometimes, a lot of the things that happened many, many years ago, like Dick Tracy talking to his wristwatch, They happened then,
We
they
have them now.
imagined it, and now it becomes, so.
Right, exactly.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? We have some people, anybody else? We have some people dropping off. Anybody else have any other questions? If not, I am going to stop the recording. So thank you everybody for coming. It has been amazing. And don't forget that we have a lecture in person for those of you that are still here on Tuesday at 4 o'clock in the multipurpose room. And we're going to be talking about Greenwich Village in the 1960s. So that is at 4 o'clock. So thank you everybody. And again, I'm going to hit stop recording and then you guys can say whatever you like or ask any questions.
Thank you,